Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about adapting tabletop role-playing games into video games versus adapting a non-game IP into a video game. I think the into the video game part should probably be implicit because I've never adapted anything into anything else but a video game. So let's talk about the pros and cons of having a tabletop RPG versus a non-game RPG, a non-game IP. This is an answer to a question from Dr. John Wooberg, who asked, I'm curious, since you did adaptations of D&D and Vampire the Masquerade, but also South Park, what kinds of challenges did you find making a game based on another type of game versus making a game based on something non-interactive like a TV show? That is a really interesting question, and no one has ever asked that before. By the way, that's, if you're wondering like what you can do, Dr. John's question is really interesting to me because it's like, oh, I've literally done a video on what it was like to work in other people's game IPs, and there's a link below. And specifically, that's Temple of Elemental Evil and Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, which were tabletop games that I helped adapt into a video game. Similarly, I worked on making a non-game IP, which was the TV show and movies, South Park, into a video game. Very different things. I would recommend you watch both of those videos because I go in depth on the fun and challenges of making those games. And also keep in mind that I also have playlists for every single game I've made. So there's a Temple playlist, a Vampire Masquerade playlist, and a South Park playlist. You might want to watch those too, or you might not. But in this one, I'm going to talk about specifically things that were advantageous on one of those. Either, like, what advantages do I have over making a video game from a tabletop versus a non-game IP? And then what were the cons? So let's dive into that. And I'll start with the pros, and I'm going to start by talking about the pros of converting a tabletop into a video game, a tabletop RPG into a video game. And you can think of that as well. These are obviously the cons of a non-game IP. And specifically, yes, I'm talking generically, but my experience was D&D and Vampire the Masquerade into video games and South Park into a video game. So the tabletop RPGs have rules, and this is great because that means you don't have to invent everything. That's a huge pro. Just the fact that you're not starting sort of with a tabula rasa, and a lot of people get paralyzed by that. It's like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be making. I could make anything. By the time I came on to South Park, they had already kind of decided the framework of the game, although I'll talk about, we made some changes. But having a tabletop RPG at least gives you a scope, and that's another thing I really don't want to forget. A huge advantage of taking a game IP and making it into a video game is your work is already scoped for you. You already know that there's going to be certain classes or certain skills or certain kinds of monsters, or that certain mechanics will be in there for combat or for stealth, for crafting. You know this because it's in the tabletop rules. Now, you may not be able to do all of them, or you may not be able to do all of them without any adaptation, because there may be like horseback riding rules. You're like, oh, we're not going to really have the ability or time to get horseback riding in. Or there may be rules that work when there's a human GM, because there's a lot of rules that say, this relies on the common sense of the GM, and there is no common sense in a computer. So some of them have to be adapted, and some of them have to be thrown away. But at least you have a lot of pins in place before you even start. And this scope, by the way, I'm talking about isn't just for the mechanics. It's also for the setting. So, when I was making Temple of Elemental Evil, the Greyhawk setting is well defined and well described. So our artists could get started right away on making maps and props and buildings and people and equipment because we knew what it was going to look like. And similarly with the mechanics, that stuff was already laid out well. So we had to talk about, hey, is this going to get adapted? How are we going to do the UI for it? Are we going to include this at all? But it gave us a big leap forward into what's normally done when you're trying to make something with an original IP. So the scope, don't sweep that under the rug. Just having a scope defined for you is great. Another thing that's great about tabletop RPGs is they usually come with characters that you can make use of. There's characters in the module. There are well-known characters that are part of the setting. That, in Vampire the Masquerade, all the different factions had leaders that were fairly well defined. And you know what the factions stand for and how people in those factions act. Now, this isn't nearly as detailed. This is not nearly as detailed as the characters from a book or a TV show. Because for South Park, everybody knew how Cartman looked, how he acted, what he would do, what his viewpoints on things were. But that's probably a good segue into the cons, because you get limited in your creative freedom in different ways when you work on a tabletop game into a video game versus a non-game IP into a video game. Tabletop RPGs can really limit your creative freedom because you have a limit in what adaptations you can make. If you're making a D&D game like I did, people expect those classes. They expect to find a fighter and a wizard and a thief and a cleric. You can't really not include those. I mean, I even told you, I tried to back off from doing bard, druid, and I think paladin because they had so many special roles. And the publisher was like, no, people expect those. And I didn't disagree with them. My point was, I agree people expect those, but I got 18 months here. We did it anyway. That expectation that people have for mechanics means you can't veer very far away. As opposed to when we made South Park, the sky was the limit. We experimented with lots of different rules for how the game would proceed. We had lots of different combat mechanics. We were experimenting with different combat mechanics less than a year before we shipped. I came up with an idea for a different way of handling the battlefield and turn-based than the one we eventually shipped with. But what was interesting to me is that we were still looking at things like that far into development, as opposed to, when we started Temple, it was like, guys, I'm going to show you. Some people had played D&D before, some people hadn't. We did Wednesday afternoon D&D sessions, and in a few weeks, everybody knew exactly how D&D was supposed to go. It was, these are the mechanics. We have to have these. Similarly, there's a limit in the stories you can tell in different ways. In tabletop RPGs, there's an expectation of the scope and type of stories you're going to tell. I don't believe a God of War-like story where you're going around killing off the entire pantheon of gods would have worked in Temple of Elemental Evil. I don't think they would have been real happy if part of what you did was kill off the entire Greyhawk pantheon of gods. And also that was beyond the scope of the game, but it was also not what the story was about. So very limited in that sense. Now a TV show is limited in a different way. With South Park in specific, we had to get the look of the characters in the background perfectly right. And not just the look, but the animation. They looked and moved in a certain way. The best non-game description I've ever given someone is, if you asked me to bake you a cake, I could whip out a cake. In a couple hours, we're going to be eating a good cake. It'll be yummy and it'll look good. But if you showed me a picture of a cake and said, can you make me exactly this cake? I want it to be that color. I want the decorations to be exactly the same. I want it to be that size. That's a lot harder because, first of all, do I have the pans to make that kind of cake, that size and shape? Do I have the ingredients? Do I have the skill to decorate it that way? And also, you want it exactly the same. So even if I could make something similar, if you want it exactly the same, it's a lot harder. And that's what our artists were up against for South Park, because the look and animation of those characters had to be perfect. Now you may go, well, they're getting the voiceover from Matt and Trey on the characters. And you're right. But the dialogue that they wrote, we wrote that. And they would approve it. And that had to be the exact dialogue that you would expect to be coming out of Cartman's mouth or Kenny's mouth. And that was very specific. So they did the VO, but the style of the narrative design was very specific. So the artists and narrative designers had a lot of work cut out for them to mimic that exactly. I'm making sure I'm going over everything because I'm like, there were so many things we had to do. By the way, tabletop RPG has a very similar limit in the look. When we were making Vampire the Masquerade, there was an expectation of what vampires would look like and how they'd act. Nobody wanted brightly colored vampires. Nobody wanted silly, joking vampires. There was a certain gravitas to Bloodlines vampires. Can you imagine if we had made a game that was set still in Santa Monica, so still in Southern California, but took place entirely during the day, with very soap opera-like non-vampire humans going about their day and having their challenges, and the player's one of them, and then occasionally there'd be a storyline on the news or in the newspaper about odd occurrences that would just remind you, this is a Vampire the Masquerade game. I don't think anybody would have liked that. That would have been horrible. I don't think we could have gotten that approved, but I don't think any of you would have wanted to play that game, which is just to say that if you diverge too much from any original source material, whether it's from a tabletop game or a non-game IP, people are going to be unhappy. And I think if you scratch your head, you can think of some IPs that got made into video games that people didn't like how it was transferred into that medium. Now, I say all this, I want to be a big caveat now at the end. I'm on record as saying, given the choice, given a big bag of money, I would rather make my own original IP. However, since I was doing the pros and cons of this list, it made me realize if I had to make a game using another IP, so someone gave me a bag of money and said, all I'm going to ask you to do is we'll buy an IP for you and you will make a game out of it. If I had to do that, then for me, I think I'd rather adapt a tabletop RPG into a video game than a non-game IP. And I think the reason for that is when you gamify a non-game IP, it inherently makes it feel different. You have to be very careful with how the characters act in a gamified world, how NPCs react to that gamified world. And plus, on top of it, I'll just admit that there are other developers out there with far more experience and will be much better at adapting a non-game IP into a video game. So if someone gave me a big bag of money and said, you can make a game, but it's got to be based on an existing IP, I would pick a game IP to do and not a non-game IP. But that's just for me. Anyway, I hope this answers all of your questions. Dr. John Wooberg.